Hi, this is Eddie Caro. Welcome to another episode of the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast, where you learn new skills with the help of experts. Politics, religion, diversity, issues with the law. There are so many topics that, as people in positions of leadership, we refuse to talk about because we want to stay out of it. We do not want to be controversial. But there are instances when it's necessary to speak out because it aligns with values and it can even be good for business. Today, we talk about when and how to speak out with Matt Kohut. Matt is the author of Speaking Out, The New Rules of Business Leadership Communication, and other books as well. As a managing partner of KNP Communications, Matt has prepared CEOs, elected officials, and public figures for events from live television appearances to TED Talks. Let's listen. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I read your book, Speaking Out, and I want to know more about speaking out overall, particularly in this particular year. Like, a lot of uh, political things happening. So I want to speak with you in regards of the best practices for leaders, managers, in terms of when to speak out and how to speak out. But I want to know more first in terms of your background, because you've been focusing communications. How do you came up with how do you ended up in the field in communications?
Well, I got into this from the speech writing side of things. I was working as a speechwriter over 20 years ago, and a couple of folks who I met who were also speechwriters were perplexed by what made people good speakers and less effective speakers, and it led us on this journey to really try and become effective at helping people be the best speakers they can be in any setting, whether they're giving a keynote or talking on television or anything like that. And that began, like I said, about 20 years ago, and here we are. This has really been my life's work for a long, long time. And in the course of getting to work with leaders of organizations in all sectors over the past several years, this question of addressing political and social issues has increasingly come to the fore. And that's really what the book Speaking Out is about, is how leaders, particularly in the corporate sector, but really in any sector, can make decisions that are informed about when, if, when, and how to take a stance on a given political or social issue.
Yeah, so that is a very uh, kind of a touchy subject for any manager or leader in any company because debating when is it good? Should I speak out as a leader of a company or a team or in terms of any topic? Should leaders speak out on any specific issues?
Well, I think this is where I give the good, unsatisfying answer that it depends. I think there are times when leaders should say something, and there are plenty of times when leaders shouldn't say something. And as you said, it's touchy, and there are always opportunities to make people unhappy when you take a stand on issues. And so I think that a lot of making these decisions comes down to thinking first, listening, and then deciding, is this an opportunity where I should say something or I should keep my counsel and keep my mouth shut?
So, thinking of you're mentioning about listening, are you referring to listening to people within the organization, customers? What do you mean when you say defining when to speak out based on listening?
Well, you're on exactly the right track. It's really listening to your core stakeholders. A lot of times those are employees, but it can also be your customers. It can also be your investors. Every leader, whether CEO or in a nonprofit or some other sector, has people to whom they're ultimately accountable. And it's really understanding why does this issue matter to the organization itself? How does it matter to these different groups, employees, customers, suppliers, other stakeholders who have a real investors who have a real stake in this company, and deciding, is this something where it's worth planting a flag in the ground, so to speak? And if I do so, who's going to be unhappy about that? Who's going to feel like I stood up for them in some way?
And that's a part that we're scared of in terms of who do we make unhappy about speaking out on subjects. But are there any no are there any specific limitations? No limitations, let's say, um, topics that are certainly out of scope of when a leader should speak out. Are there any boundaries on that?
Absolutely. I think that in the very first place, a lot of times the topic's just clearly out of scope, and leaders should stay as far away from them as possible. To a large extent, this is about reputation and brand management. It's the personal reputation of the leader as well as the reputation of the organization. If that's going to be put significantly at risk, don't go near it.
Mhm.
That sounds cautious, but I think that that's your job as the person who's advising a leader. And also, if as a leader, you're always thinking about that. You put so much sweat into building equity in your brand personally, but more importantly in the organization. And to throw that away with one ill-conceived comment on this issue or that issue that might be a fleeting issue is absolutely reckless. So yeah, there are plenty of issues that are out of scope. How you define that, I think, really varies from organization to organization. That's the tricky part.
So let's get into specifics. For example, in the topic of diversity and inclusion, there's been a lot of conversations around it in terms of diversity hires or just leaders speaking out about the need to what happens when we remove any DEI initiatives. What are some of the best ways to approach that particular topic?
Well, so there's the speaking out about it, and then there's the context around this. You're right. There's been a backlash over the past 16, 18 months or something, where a lot of organizations feel like diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that they're being quieter about than they might have been prior to that. I think that that's, first off, I think it's unfortunate on many levels, because I think that the companies that are continuing to talk about this actually have a strategic advantage where it comes to trying to attract talent that cares about this. When you look at Gen Z is the most diverse generation this country's ever known. And I think because of that, younger professionals are looking to work in an environment where they're going to be comfortable. And part of that is being in a place that recognizes that people are diverse. So I think that there's a strategic advantages that some organizations have seen by bucking this backlash in some way and saying, you know what, we're still going to say DEI. We're still going to talk about diversity. Other organizations have rebranded their diversity initiatives. They're not using the same language. They're not certainly calling it DEI, but they're still continuing to do the work. So I think part of it's the way people talk about it. Now, there is also a legal context here that's worth acknowledging. There have been, in the period since the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action for universities, there's a lot of concern that there's going to be legal action taken against corporations for diversity initiatives. And there has been some language coming out of certain members of Congress threatening in this respect. So a lot of corporations are, I think, reasonably making sure that they're not getting ahead of where they're going to get themselves into trouble legally. And look, nobody's going to do anything, any communications expert is never going to tell you to do something that's going to get you into hot water where you're pushing things and it's going to prompt legal action against your organization. So I think people are always watching that and thinking, where is the center of this issue right now? So I think the backlash is in some way cultural, but also it's informed by this very real political pressure that is suggesting that there's potentially a legal fight coming here.
Interesting. And when it comes to political topics, and now by the time of the when we are recording this conversation, it's 2024 election season in the United States. When is it appropriate for leaders to address political topics, if any?
Well, so such an interesting question right now. We're literally the weekend before the presidential election, and just today, a whole host of former CEOs endorsed Kamala Harris. There was a letter that several of them signed. I don't know if it was 2 dozen or so people who were very respected former CEOs who said, look, our peers who are now sitting on our seats couldn't do this. They basically acknowledged that people who have customers in blue states and red states don't want to alienate people. They don't want to make a splash by choosing one side or the other and risk having customers turn away from them. But these former CEOs said, we have a very clear perspective on this. We're hearing this from many of our colleagues who are now sitting in our former seats, but they can't say anything. So I think that there's a business leader community of the alumni CEOs, if you will, who have actually been quite vocal, even as of today, on one side of the campaign versus the other. Now, as far as people who are sitting CEOs right now, there have been some notable exceptions. There have been a few people who have been very vocal supporters of both former President Trump and Vice President Harris. They're few and far between because, number one, you run the risk of alienating customers. Number two, you run the risk of alienating a future administration, especially if you're in a highly regulated industry. That administration could essentially make things difficult for you. So I think a lot of CEOs staying away from the politics of this makes good common sense from a strategy point of view. Now, that said, I think the opportunity that I think a lot of CEOs have foregone here is that they could and should stand up for democracy. And this is very interesting. There was just a poll out a couple of weeks ago by Weber Shandwick that actually asked the public about this. And they said, should CEOs speak up against election interference and speak out in favor of free and fair elections? And the public, Republicans and Democrats alike, roughly 2/3 of both sides agreed this was a good idea. So I do think that there is a role for CEOs in speaking in favor of the democratic system that underpins the success of their businesses. There's a business case for this. It's not just a nice thing to do. I think there's a sound rationale for doing it. And I haven't seen so much of it. A few people have said some things, but not as many as I would think you might in a time like this.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, in terms of the results for the business, because it's not just could be politics or could be other topics. The you mentioned in the book about the need to speak out on specific things or policies or um, uh, companies doing something wrong. We need to address the elephant in the room and things along those lines. So there is a business benefit to that. Could you talk about that in terms that it's just not from an ethical standpoint, speaking in regards to something, but there's also the benefit for organizations to do that?
Oh, absolutely. So I'll give you a really simple, straight down the middle example. The CEO of Random House, the biggest publisher of books in the United States, spoke out against book bans. Now, that what could be simpler than the person who's making a lot of books saying, "Hey, we shouldn't ban books." So there are plenty of examples where CEOs speak out against either social currents. That's really not about a legal thing for the most part. It's primarily more about social movement, and the same is true when things happen politically. I mean, CEOs have always been navigating political and social issues. What's different about the last several years is that they're using their own microphones to do it. They used to be doing this primarily behind the scenes through lobbyists and so on. They're still doing it with the lobbyists and behind the scenes, but they're also stepping up to the microphone themselves and using social media themselves. And that's what's different here. So are always going to be opportunities for CEOs to advocate for their business's interests, like you had just asked, or speak out against something that goes against their interests. That is now happening more with the CEO at the front and center of things more often than it did in the past. I think that's really what's different. That's a lot of what prompted me to write the book.
Yeah, and now let's get into the specifics of the as a leader, either a manager of a big section within the company. I decided as a leader to speak out about a specific topic. What's the approach? What are kind of the steps to follow in terms of what's next? Just yes, aside from just calling the media out and talking in regards of something. So, but what are some of the steps that need to be taken to make sure that it's done in an effective manner?
Well, I think you start by asking yourself first and foremost, why does this matter for our business? What's the relevance to the mission? And you can then in some way take that and filter that against the organization's values. What are our values? How would saying something be a reflection of our values? And I think the values thing is something that's probably underlooked, because when you run something through the screen of your organizational values, if you can't make a clear connection, maybe you shouldn't be saying it. If
Mm,
your values don't support it, then why are you going to put yourself out there? So mission and values, I think, are number one and number two. And then after that, that's where you go to your stakeholder analysis. You ask us, am I saying this because our employees are facing pressures in our society where we need to stand up for them? Is it about something that our customers care deeply about? You go through the stakeholder groups and ask yourself how this is going to resonate with them to the best that you understand them. And once you've done all that, then you're in a position to make the decision about if you're going to speak out or not. Now, I think a thing that's underplayed a lot is when employees are the primary group, you have a big choice to make here, which is, do you speak to them internally or do you speak externally? And a lot of organizations have very lively discussion about political and social issues internally that employees really rely on, and they never do this externally. Now, in these days, anything that's said internally, of course, can be leaked externally, but broadly speaking, I think there is an internal external decision that has to be made, and that's a really important judgment to make, because a lot of times you should, if employees are the primary audience, speak to employees rather than feeling like you have to get to LinkedIn and let the whole world know this immediately.
yeah, that's great. And as you point out, the deciding if it's an internal topic or external topic and how to do it effectively, as you say, with depending on which is the what's the objective. Are there, you do describe examples in the book about speaking out gone wrong. Could you describe an example of speaking out which had some backlash?
Sure. Now, I'm sure a lot of people remember in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, every major corporation felt pressure to do something to address this in some way. And one of the companies that did this was the bank Wells Fargo. And they had a relatively new CEO. I think he'd only been there since November of the previous year or so. And he made a series of statements about what the bank was going to do about, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks after the incident. And they were specific things he said that the bank would do. So and then again, this was very consistent with a lot of other organizations. He said, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And one of the things they were going to do is double their Black leadership at the executive level. And during that summer, after having said this, he was caught during a Zoom call saying, well, the pipeline just doesn't exist in our business to do that. We don't have the talent, was essentially what he was saying. And this got leaked
Mm.
outside of the organization, and it just caused a tremendous backlash. And I've heard from people who were at Wells Fargo that there was actually a bit of an exodus of talent from the organization in the months after that. So that's a very clear example, because I think what it speaks to is the importance of accountability. It's not enough to say something. If you're going to say something, you have to do something.
Mhm.
And the thing you do has to be consistent with what you said. And he said one thing, the bank ultimately backed down from what it said it was going to do, never really showed that traceable accountability. I think that's a huge part of this.
Yeah, and that's a good example of noting that in this day and age, like everything could be leaked, everything could be. We speak out assuming that it could become public at any moment.
Right.
Uh, And so that kind of segues into the importance of just empathetic leaders and other skills that leaders in tech or leaders in any of our in corporate organizations need to have. You do talk about that in the book of the importance of soft skills. Can you talk about that? How the importance of that and what specific skills would you consider that leaders need to develop?
I think that you mentioned empathy, and that's really at the core, one of the most important ones. Now, how empathy manifests in large part is by listening. And I have a little chapter in the book about the importance of listening, and it specifically focuses on employees. I mean, you have to listen to your investors and you have to listen to your customers and all the other key stakeholders. But I think the employees are the ones you're seeing day in and day out, face to face, so to speak. And one of the things that I really enjoyed learning more about as I was researching the book was talking to people about how their CEOs, their leaders, are listening to their employees. And one of the cases that really stood out for me was at LinkedIn, where when executives are thinking about taking a stance or addressing an issue outside the company, they talk to people and really they listen to people in the employee resource groups that are affected by the issue. And just listening as opposed to saying something is a huge part of that. Just trying to understand, what is this person's lived experience? How is it different from mine? How can I just listen and take it in rather than trying to respond and wrap it up when I really have no basis for that in my own lived experience? I think that's an incredibly powerful thing to be able to do for people. And it also helps you to then realize, wait, there's a lot I don't understand here. This person who has this lived experience on the inside here has to feel like whatever we say matches their experience working here, let alone what they're experiencing when they go home at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And listening so important and such an overlooked skill that we need to develop because we think of speaking out as having that, eloquent in order to be able to express a message. But as you say, listening is very important. And are there any other skills that, in order for leaders to effectively speak out on subjects, that you think we should be working to develop more?
Well, the last thing I said is sort of a corollary to the listening, which is making sure that what's going on the inside of the company reflects what you're going to be saying externally. So I think that's an
Mm,
important part of it. And then there's this other question of accountability I mentioned before. If you're
right.
going to do something, you have to, if you're going to say something, you have to be able to do something, and you have to make it something that the people who you're talking to understand as relevant and worthwhile. And again, that does speak to the importance of consulting people and understanding what really matters to them and what they care about. And so I think that accountability step is something that leaders can think about. And that's a soft skill as well, making sure that you devise what your whole approach based on, here's what I want to address, here's how I'm going to say it based on what I understand, and here's how I'm going to show that this was not just words, there's action behind those words.
That's great, great advice. And one last thing, in terms of the, uh, as a communicator, when it comes to the time to speak out and either speaking publicly or even in a writing format, what are some recommendations that you have in terms of how language should be used? What type of tone to adopt? Are there any recommendations on that?
Well, look, there are all kinds of sensitivities on one topic or another, so it's hard to generalize about that. I do think it's worth talking to lots of people, getting input from a lot of people about things, whether you're writing or about to say something orally, and making sure that you're using language that shows that you've listened and that you understand what matters to people. And that really varies from topic to topic, but there are so many ways to sound like you have a bad ear about something, what we call a tin ear, where you had a nice intent but you said it so terribly. So I do think that whenever you're doing something like that, you have to let other people check your homework, so to speak, and you have to rely on people who are professionals about this, your communications team, whatever agencies or whoever you trust about this stuff, and really road test things internally, even if it's quick as far as the turnaround. You can't rely on just your own gut in this because the stakes are too high. And like I said, an unforced error can really set you back so dramatically.
Absolutely, yeah. Anything you say, as anything we say, it's we just have to be very careful in how do we approach it. So, thank you so much for all this advice and speaking about the importance of taking a stance in which cases and the importance of speaking out for as leaders. So, what's the best way for people to contact you if they have any questions?
Oh, you can find me at my website, matthewkohut.com, and I'd be happy to follow up with people and just learn more about what their interest in this is.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.